I'm Clara Monroe, 37 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life fixing other people's smiles while forgetting how to hold on to my own. I've built a steady career, kept a tidy home, and given my family more than I ever kept for myself. But on one cold Friday evening, the balance I thought I could maintain finally cracked. It began with laughter, bright, careless laughter, echoing through a house that wasn't supposed to hold anyone but me. By the time I stepped onto the porch, I could already feel it in my chest, that quiet, unmistakable knowing that something sacred had been trespassed. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever worked hard just to be treated like you didn't matter. I live in Denver, where the air is thin and the days move fast. Dentistry wasn't my dream job, but it became my refuge, a place where control and care still meant something. My coworkers call me the anchor because no matter how chaotic the office gets, I keep it steady. I took on extra shifts when our head doctor's wife fell ill, covered schedules no one else wanted, and stayed late, balancing numbers that weren't mine to fix. It's what I do. It's what I've always done. My hands can hold a drill steady through fatigue and frustration, but lately even that focus has begun to fray. The only thing that ever grounded me was my cabin by the lake in Evergreen, a small wooden house that smells like cedar and rain, tucked between tall pines and still water. I bought it 3 years ago, with every ounce of savings I had, and to this day, it's the only thing that feels entirely mine. I'd wake up there before sunrise, watch the mist roll across the water, and breathe like I hadn't in weeks. No phone buzzing, no voices asking for help, just the sound of the lake against the dock. I built that piece board by board, believing I could always return to it when the world got too loud. But family has a way of turning peace into obligation. My parents live an hour south, both retired and endlessly kind to everyone, especially to my brother Evan. He's the golden child, the one who makes them laugh even when he's let them down. They worry about him, constantly calling him sensitive when he can't hold a job, tired when he sleeps half the day, trying when the rent is 3 months late. When he married Brittany 2 years ago, my mother cried over the cost of their wedding. She deserves something beautiful, she said. I agreed, and I wrote an $18,000 check to make it happen. It didn't stop there. When Evan lost his apartment, I paid his rent. When Brittany wanted a new car, I covered the down payment because she said she couldn't drive something that old. When they wanted to host Thanksgiving but couldn't afford groceries, I filled their fridge. My parents called me generous. Evan called me a lifesaver. Brittany called me when she wanted something, and I called it being a good sister. Brittany is the kind of woman who looks flawless in every photo-polished hair, long lashes, and that brand of confidence that feels rehearsed. From our first dinner together, I could tell she saw me as useful, not equal. She'd sip her wine and laugh softly, saying things like, "You work too much, Clara. You should try living a little." I'd nod and smile, pretending not to notice how my parents stayed silent, their eyes fixed on their plates. If I brought it up later, Mom would sigh. "She's just young, sweetheart. Don't take it personally." And Dad would add, "You know how easily your brother gets upset. Let's not make waves." So I didn't. I learned to hold my tongue, to smooth every edge until nothing of me showed. Still, something in me had started to shift. Each time my phone lit up with another request, another, "Can you help us out just this once?" A little piece of me went quiet. I began noticing the imbalance, how every conversation circled back to money, how my achievements became invisible the moment my brother entered the room. I bought my own home. "Well, you don't have kids, Clara. I got a promotion." "Don't work too hard, honey." Evan missed another payment. He's under pressure. It was always the same script, and I'd started to realize my role in it. That's why that Friday meant so much. It wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. It was supposed to be a breath. I'd spent the week buried in patience, half asleep at my desk, running on caffeine and autopilot. When the weekend finally came, I packed my bag with a bottle of wine, some pasta, and a few good intentions. The drive to Evergreen was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you believe everything will fall back into place once you arrive. I remember watching the mountains roll by, humming softly to the radio, already picturing the view from my porch. But when I pulled into the gravel drive, the sight that met me didn't make sense. Cars lined the yard, cars I didn't recognize. Lights glowed from every window. Music spilled into the night. And from behind the glass, laughter, loud, careless laughter that had no place in my home. I froze on the steps, keys in hand, every sound pressing against me like static. Through the window, I saw them faces I didn't know, drinks in hand, dancing under my lights. And right in the center, in my linen shirt, stood Brittany Monroe, smirking like she'd been waiting for me all along. What happened next would unravel everything I thought I knew about Love Family and where I truly belonged. By the time I reached for the doorknob, my pulse was already unsteady. The house was glowing from inside, lights spilling through the curtains, laughter rising and falling like waves. The music was loud enough to shake the floorboards, a pulsing beat that didn't belong in my quiet retreat. I hesitated, the cold biting through my coat, every sense caught between disbelief and dread. Then I turned the handle. The door swung open easily, and warmth, perfume, and noise rushed out all at once, flooding the porch with the scent of spilled wine and something fried. I stepped inside and stopped. 10, maybe 12 people crowded the living room. The table I'd built myself was covered in half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and a plate of chips someone had dropped directly onto the wood. My favorite blanket was thrown over a chair, and the rug near the door was streaked with muddy footprints. A tall man I didn't recognize was stirring a pot in my kitchen while a woman leaned against the counter taking selfies. My eyes moved across the chaos until they landed on the center of the room. Brittany stood there, a glass of rosé in hand, wearing my linen shirt like it was a borrowed accessory. Her expression froze the second she saw me. For a breath, everything stopped, the chatter, the movement, the rhythm of the music. Then she smiled, that sharp, practiced smile I knew too well. "Well," she said, her voice stretching the word, "look who showed up." She looked me over like she was appraising an uninvited guest. I scanned the room, searching for Evan. He stood by the window, a beer in hand, eyes fixed on the floorboards. Not one person moved to greet me. "I didn't know anyone was here," I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected. "This is my weekend." Brittany tilted her head the way she always did when she was about to say something condescending. "We have a key," she replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We just thought we'd use the place for a little family getaway. You don't mind, do you?" Something about the way she said we made the air feel thin. I looked at Evan, waiting for him to say something, to explain, to defend, to stop her, but he stayed silent, his shoulders tight, face turned away. "I do mind," I said finally. "You all need to leave, tonight." For a second, nobody reacted. Then someone near the kitchen laughed nervously and turned the volume down on the speaker. Brittany blinked, then gave a small, disbelieving laugh that quickly turned sharp. "Are you serious?" "We just got here." The room went still. Eyes turned toward me, waiting to see what I'd do. The heat from the fireplace pressed against my back, but my hands felt cold. "This isn't a rental," I said, clearer this time. "I didn't give you permission to be here." Her voice cut through the air, higher now, every word meant to humiliate. "You always have to ruin things, don't you, God? Evan, your sister is impossible." He said nothing, just stood there, his beer-half-raised eyes still fixed on the floor. Brittany turned her glass, lifting as if to make a toast. "Why is this stupid leech here? Get out!" The word hit harder than a slap. Leech. It echoed through me, hollow and ugly, bouncing off the walls I'd painted with my own hands. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stared at her, the perfect hair, the painted nails, the smug grin, and realized I'd spent years mistaking politeness for peace. She wasn't family to me. I'd just been her wallet. The room waited for me to explode, to fight back, to break the image they all had of me, the quiet, reliable one who never made trouble. But something inside me shifted instead. A calmness I didn't recognize settled over my shoulders. I reached for my car keys on the counter, feeling their cold weight in my palm. I met her gaze and smiled, not the polite smile I'd given 100 times before, but a quiet one stripped of every ounce of pretense. "Okay," I said. Her grin widened, victorious. "Good," she said, turning to her cousin Marla with a laugh that sounded like glass breaking. I walked past her, through the living room, past the couch, where her parents pretended to scroll through their phones. Evan didn't meet my eyes as I passed. The air outside was cold enough to sting. My hands shook when I unlocked my car, but it wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity, clean and sharp. The driveway was lined with strange cars, their tires leaving deep tracks in the gravel. As I backed out, I looked once more at the cabin light spilling through the windows, figures moving inside like silhouettes against my walls. They'd turned my peace into noise, my refuge into a playground. The taillights swept across the trees as I drove away, and by the time I reached the main road, the only sound left was the hum of my tires and the wind pressing against the glass. When I got home, the apartment felt smaller than usual, too quiet after the chaos. I unpacked the groceries I'd bought for the weekend wine pasta chocolate and lined them up on the counter like pieces of an old routine. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the blank wall ahead of me until the silence settled into something solid. My phone buzzed once on the counter. Evan's name lit up the screen, then disappeared when I didn't answer. Another message followed from Mom. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I turned the phone face down and took a slow breath. The city outside my window had gone gray streetlights flickering on in the distance. I opened my laptop, signed into my bank account, and stared at the list of transactions, line after line of money that had flowed out over the last 2 years. Rent payments, car loans, transfers labeled help, or just this once. More than $50,000 gone, not for emergencies or kindness, but to keep the peace. I closed the laptop and sat still for a long time. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone to complain or ask why it had gone so far. I just made a quiet decision. I would stop. No announcements, no confrontation, no warning, just a clean break. When morning came, the city was still. The first light slid through the blinds, brushing across the table where my untouched groceries sat. I made tea instead of coffee, the steam rising in small, steady curls. The taste was bitter, but it cleared the haze from my mind. By the time I left for work, my decision had already settled into something firm. I was done being the family's safety net, done being invisible. I didn't know what kind of storm that would bring, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. The morning after I left the lake house, the air in Denver felt heavy, like it carried the weight of everything I hadn't said. The night before kept replaying in my mind the music, the laughter, the way Brittany's voice had sliced through the room as if she owned it. I'd smiled, walked out, and driven home in silence, but that calmness hadn't left me. It had settled into something quieter, something sharper. For years I'd told myself that staying quiet kept the peace, but I was starting to realize it had only kept me small. At work that Monday, I moved through my appointments the way I always did. Steady hands, practiced smile, polite conversation. But inside, my focus kept drifting. Each time my phone buzzed in the corner of my desk, my chest tightened. I didn't have to check to know who it was. By lunch, there were 6 missed calls and 2 texts from Evan. "Call me back, Clara. We need to talk." I didn't. That evening, after the office emptied and the last patient's chart was closed, I stayed behind with the lights low and my laptop open. I signed into my online banking, the same account I'd barely looked at beyond paying bills. Seeing the numbers laid out in front of me felt like staring at a map of my own choices. Rent transfers, car payments, grocery reimbursements, all leading back to my brother. It added up to more than I wanted to admit. Over $50,000 in 2 years. Half a down payment, half a life. I scrolled slowly through the transactions, each one a memory of a moment when I'd told myself, it's just this once. I remembered the phone calls, his voice strained but charming, always with the same promise to pay me back when things got better. I'd believed him every time. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. Then, without hesitation, I clicked to remove his name from my emergency account. One confirmation window appeared. I pressed yes. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I wasn't tired. I wasn't angry either. I felt still. I stopped for coffee on the way to the bank, stood in line with half a dozen other people, and waited for my turn. When the teller asked what I needed, I smiled. "I'd like to update my account," I said. "Remove a secondary user." She typed for a few seconds, asked for a name, and I gave it to her. "Evan Monroe. A few keystrokes later, he was gone from every shared record. It took less than 5 minutes to undo years of enabling. When I got home, I opened my laptop again. One by one, I canceled every automatic payment that had been quietly draining my paycheck. The rent transfer, the car loan, even the joint credit card I'd forgotten existed. Each click made the space around me feel wider. By the time I shut the lid, the apartment felt like it had exhaled. It didn't take long for the storm to find me. The following Friday, my phone lit up with Evan's name just as I was leaving work. I hesitated but answered. "Clara, what the hell?" he said before I could even speak. "Our rent didn't go through. The landlord called." "What's going on?" "It didn't go through because I stopped paying it," I said, keeping my voice even. He laughed once, a dry, uncertain sound. "What do you mean you stopped? You can't just—" "I can," I said. "And I did. I also removed your access to my emergency account and canceled the car payments." There was silence. I could hear him breathing, waiting for me to say it was a joke. When I didn't, his voice dropped. "Brittany's right about you. You think you're better than everyone else." "No," I said quietly. I just finally learned where to draw the line. The call ended without a goodbye. 10 seconds later, Brittany's name flashed across my screen. I didn't answer. Then came another call. And another. When I finally set my phone down, it buzzed again, this time with text messages, long ones full of accusations and insults. "You're selfish. You're bitter. You've always been jealous." I read each word without reacting. The last message stopped me. "Family doesn't abandon family." I typed one line back. "You did that when you told me to get out of my own house." Then I blocked her number. The quiet that followed was almost comforting. By Sunday, the silence stretched into calm. No calls, no apologies, no one asking for money. For the first time in years, I had an entire day that belonged to me. I made breakfast, watered my plants, and opened the windows. The city outside was bright and cold, but the air felt different, cleaner somehow. That evening, as the sun set behind the buildings, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me said to pick up. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Clara, honey, what's going on?" Her voice was soft, cautious. "Evan called. He's very upset. He said you're cutting him off." "I'm not cutting him off," I said. "I'm just done paying his bills." She sighed. "Brittany was drunk that night at the cabin. You know how she gets. Don't let one mistake ruin the family." "It wasn't one mistake," I said. "Please," she whispered. "Let's not turn this into a war." "I'm not," I said. "I'm ending it." There was silence on the other end, just the faint sound of her breathing. "You've always been so stubborn," she said finally. "Maybe," I replied, "but I think I learned it from you." Then I ended the call before she could say more. That night I didn't feel triumphant or angry. I just felt steady, like I'd finally stopped running in circles. A few days later I drove back to Evergreen. The air was colder than before, the trees along the road rimmed with frost. A locksmith met me at the gate, his van idling while he unpacked his tools. I stood by the water as he worked, watching thin sheets of ice form along the edges of the lake. When he handed me the new keys, I turned one over in my palm. It was lighter than I expected. Inside the cabin was quiet, but the smell of perfume and spilled wine still lingered. I opened the windows and let the cold air in until the last trace of them was gone. Then I built a fire in the fireplace and sat in the chair by the window, the one that faced the dock. The flames cracked softly, and for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. As the fire burned lower, I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and looked out at the dark water. Somewhere beneath the surface, the reflection of the house shimmered faintly, the lights from the windows bending and rippling across the lake. I watched until the shapes disappeared into blackness, and only the sound of the wind remained. For years I'd mistaken exhaustion for peace, sacrifice for love. But sitting there, surrounded by stillness, I began to understand the difference. Outside, the last ember of daylight faded, leaving the world in quiet shadow. I didn't know what would come next, but whatever it was, I'd meet it with open eyes. The week after I changed the locks at the lake house passed more quietly than I expected. My phone stayed still on the kitchen counter. No calls from Evan, no messages from my parents. For once there was nothing to fix, nothing to smooth over. Work felt different too. The same patience, the same routines, but underneath it all, a sense of stillness had taken root. I arrived on time, left on time, and went home without the weight of someone else's problems following me through the door. By Friday, that calm felt almost foreign. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city fade into its evening glow. The world outside kept moving, traffic lights, blinking neighbors coming home. But inside my apartment, it was just quiet. That kind of quiet that feels earned. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd had a week without drama, without guilt pressing against my chest. The next morning, as I was getting ready to drive to Evergreen, my phone buzzed again. Evan's name flashed across the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something in me said, "It was time. Clara." He said, his voice tight. "The landlord's threatening to evict us. The payment didn't go through again. It didn't go through because I canceled it," I said evenly. He was silent for a moment. "You can't do that. We have nowhere to go." "Yes, you can," I said quietly. "You can figure it out. Brittany's furious," he said. "She says you've turned your back on family." "Then she's right," I said. "I'm done being your safety net." There was a long pause, and then the line went dead. That afternoon, I took the drive up to the lake house. The closer I got, the lighter I felt. The air up there always smelled cleaner, sharper, like it carried its own kind of truth. When I arrived, frost had begun forming along the edges of the water. I stood outside for a while, watching the sunlight reflect off the frozen lake, listening to the faint hum of wind in the trees. The world felt untouched again. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. The firewood stacked neatly by the door, the faint scent of cedar still lingering in the walls. I lit the fireplace, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat in the same chair that had once felt haunted by betrayal. Now it just felt like mine again. The peace lasted a week before the next call came. It was my mother this time. "Clara, honey, please." She began, her tone already soft and pleading. "Your brother's having such a hard time. They've been asked to leave the apartment. Can't you help just this once more?" "No, Mom," I said gently. "I can't. You know how Brittany can be," she said, lowering her voice. "She's just upset. You're stronger than she is. Can't you be the bigger person?" "I've been the bigger person for years," I said, "and it's gotten us here." There was a sigh on the other end, the kind that sounds like surrender. "Your father doesn't understand why you're being so cold." "I'm not cold," I said quietly. "I'm finally warm enough to stop freezing for everyone else." For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I just don't want this family to fall apart." "It already did," I said. "I'm just not pretending anymore." That night, I went for a walk around the lake. The sky was clear and full of stars, their reflections dancing on the frozen water. My breath hung in the air, slow and visible. I thought about how many times I'd stood in this same spot before, always carrying someone else's burdens, always telling myself it was love. Maybe it was once, but love doesn't feel like obligation. It doesn't sound like silence every time you're the one hurt. By the end of the month, the calls had stopped coming. I figured the storm had passed, but I was wrong. It hadn't passed, it had shifted. One night while I was finishing a patient's chart, my mother called again. Her voice sounded small, almost frightened. "They've been evicted, Clara," she said quietly. "The landlord gave them a week to leave. They're moving in with us." I didn't respond right away. I could hear the nervous tapping of her fingers on the kitchen counter through the line. "It's just temporary," she added quickly, "until they find something else." Of course I said, because I knew there was nothing else to say. Temporary in our family usually meant indefinite. Over the next few weeks, the updates started coming without me asking. Mom would call late in the evening, exhaustion clear in her voice. "She doesn't help with anything, Clara. Not dishes, not laundry. She complains about the food. Your father moved the furniture for her yesterday. He threw out his back again. And when I told her to stop, she said I should be grateful to have her there." I stayed silent, the phone pressed against my ear. "Don't be cruel," Mom said softly, as if she could hear my quiet. "I'm not," I said. "You opened the door, Mom. Now you're living with what you let in." There was no anger in my voice, no bitterness, just fact. After that, the calls grew shorter. Each one ended with her voice a little more strained, her patience worn thin. 4 months passed like that. My own life became steady again. Work was calm. My patients smiled when they left my office, and so did I. I saved money for the first time in years. I spent weekends at the lake sitting on the porch with a book and a blanket, watching the water thaw bit by bit as winter gave way to spring. The cabin, once a place I dreaded returning to, had become my sanctuary again. Each time I turned the key, it felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. Then, one Sunday, my mother asked to meet for coffee. Her tone was strange, nervous, hesitant, almost guilty. When I arrived at the small cafe near their house, both my parents were already there. They looked older somehow, like the last few months had aged them more than the years before. "We wanted to tell you in person," Mom said, stirring her coffee, though she hadn't added sugar. "Evan and Brittany are getting divorced." I didn't speak. I waited. "She's been awful to him," Mom continued, "said things you wouldn't believe, called him useless, told him she wasted her life." Dad nodded, his eyes down. "He's moving out this week. She's gone back to her parents." I watched the steam rise between us, curling and fading into the air. "I see," I said quietly. Mom looked up, her eyes watery. "You were right, Clara, about all of it. We should have listened." I didn't correct her, didn't say I told you so. I just nodded, because there was nothing left to prove. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Something had shifted in the silence, something that felt like truth, finally taking its place. When I left the cafe, the sky had turned pale gray soft with the hint of spring. The air smelled of rain, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel the need to rush home. I walked slowly to my car, letting the cool air touch my face. As I drove back toward the city, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The hurt had faded, leaving behind something lighter, something closer to peace. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning of the healing, that even after everything, there was still one conversation waiting that would finally close the circle. When my parents told me about Evan and Brittany's divorce, I thought that would be the end of the chaos. But endings don't arrive all at once. They come quietly in fragments through awkward silences, unanswered calls, and the slow unraveling of what people thought would last. I didn't hear from Evan for weeks. No texts, no updates. The distance between us felt strange at first, but I didn't chase it. I let it exist. Spring was just starting to soften the edges of Denver. The air carried that faint chill that lingers before real warmth returns. At the clinic, patients were booking cleanings again after the long winter, and work kept my days full. In the evenings, I'd stop by the market near my apartment, pick up fresh fruit and flowers, and walk home with a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as I stepped through my front door, my phone buzzed. Evan's name appeared on the screen. I stood still for a moment before answering. His voice was quiet, careful. "Hey, Clara, I know it's been a while." "It has," I said. He exhaled. "I just wanted to say thanks for stopping what you were doing. I didn't get it before, but I do now." I leaned against the counter, unsure how to respond. "You're welcome," I said finally. "I mean it," he added. "I thought you were being cruel. But after everything that's happened, I see you were just being honest. Brittany left as soon as the money dried up. I didn't think she would, but she did." "I'm sorry, Evan," I said softly. "Don't be," he replied. "It's on me. I should have seen it sooner." The line went quiet. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I'm sorry too. For not standing up for you that night. For all of it." For a moment I couldn't speak. The apology landed heavier than I expected, not because of the words themselves, but because they sounded real. "We're okay," I said finally, and we were. After that, things began to shift slowly, almost imperceptibly. Evan found a new job, something steady with regular hours. My parents stopped defending him in every conversation. Instead, they started asking about my life, about my patients, about the lake house. They didn't say they were sorry for the years they'd overlooked me, but their tone had changed. There was care now and awareness that hadn't been there before. A few weeks later, my mom invited me to Sunday dinner. It had been months since I'd gone. I hesitated, but something in her voice told me it would be different this time. When I arrived, the house smelled of roast chicken and herbs, just like when we were kids. Evan was already there helping Dad set the table. He looked tired, but the kind of better that comes from effort rather than luck. "Hey, stranger," he said with a small grin. "Hey yourself," I replied. Dinner was quiet at first. The clinking of silverware filled the pauses that used to be arguments. My mother kept glancing between us as if afraid the peace might shatter, but it didn't. We ate, we talked about simple things, work the weather, a neighbor who'd moved away. It felt fragile but honest, like something still finding its shape. When the plates were cleared, Dad poured coffee and we sat together in the soft light of early evening. "You did the right thing," he said suddenly. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he lifted his cup. "Your brother needed to learn to stand on his own. We should have seen it sooner." I nodded. There was nothing to add. After dinner, Mom walked me to the door. "It's good having you here," she said, her eyes bright. "We've missed you." "I've missed this too," I admitted. She squeezed my hand. "Things are going to be better now." Driving home that night, the streetlights stretched long across the road, flickering against the windshield. I thought about how many times I'd left this house in tears, carrying the weight of everyone else's mistakes. This time, I left lighter. A week later, I decided to invite them all to the lake house. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a small dinner, something simple. I cooked pasta, opened a bottle of wine, and set the table near the window overlooking the water. When they arrived, the lake was calm, the sky streaked in pink and gold. Mom hugged me tightly, longer than she had in years. Evan helped bring in groceries without being asked. Even Dad smiled as he looked around the house. "Looks different," he said. "Feels peaceful." "It is," I said. We ate, laughed softly over old stories, and when the sun sank behind the trees, the house filled with a warmth that wasn't from the fire. It was quieter, but real. After they left that evening, I stood on the porch, the cool air brushing against my face. The lake glimmered under the first few stars. For so long, that view had reminded me of what I'd lost: trust, family, belonging. Now it reminded me of what I'd reclaimed. A few days later, I got a message from Evan. It was a photo of a small apartment with a caption that said, "Moving in next week. Feels like a fresh start." I smiled. It was strange seeing my brother finally stand on his own 2 feet, but it was the kind of strange that felt right. That night, I went to bed early, the window open, the sound of the city drifting in. The kind of peace I'd spent years searching for wasn't loud or triumphant. It was steady, like the rhythm of my own breathing, quiet, but alive. I didn't know what the next chapter of my life would look like, but for the first time I wasn't afraid to find out. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to fix. Just space wide and open for whatever came next. And somewhere between the hum of the night and the soft rustle of wind against the curtains, I realized the storm that had once drowned me had finally passed. The weeks after that dinner at the lake house settled into a kind of rhythm I hadn't known before. For the first time in years, life felt balanced. My workdays were long but peaceful, my evenings my own. I'd come home, light a candle, and let quiet fill the space. There were no late-night calls about overdue bills or tearful pleas for one more favor. Just silence, and somehow that silence felt full instead of empty. Evan was adjusting to his new life too. Every few days he'd text me small updates. Started the new job. Boss seems fair. Or finally unpacked the boxes. His messages were short, steady, and grateful. The tone between us had changed. There was no bitterness left, no defensiveness. Just the kind of honesty we'd never had before. One Saturday morning in early May, I drove to the lake house again. The air smelled like pine and thawing earth, the last traces of winter finally gone. The road wound through the hills, sunlight flickering through branches. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed how different it all looked in daylight, calm, alive, and untouched. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the faint scent of cedar and the soft creak of wood. Every trace of that long-ago party was gone. The house had reclaimed its peace. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with a book in my lap and the lake stretching wide in front of me. The surface caught the light, small ripples glinting gold and silver. For so long I'd avoided this place, afraid it would remind me of everything that happened. Now it reminded me of everything I'd survived. As the sun lowered, my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering, but her voice was lighter this time. "Honey, she said we were thinking of having everyone over for dinner next Sunday. Just the family." "I'd like that," I said. "Evan will be there too," she added gently. "That's fine," I said, and meant it. When Sunday came, I found myself standing on their porch again, the smell of home-cooked food drifting through the open window. Inside the table was already set nothing fancy, just simple and warm. Evan was in the kitchen helping Dad carve the roast, a small smile on his face. He looked different, older, steadier. When he saw me, he nodded once, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that said everything without words. Dinner was easier than I expected. We talked about work, about the weather, about how Mom wanted to replant her garden. There were pauses, but they weren't uncomfortable anymore. The tension that had once filled every silence was gone, replaced by something gentler. After dinner, as we cleared the table, Evan turned to me. "Hey," he said quietly, "I've been meaning to ask, would you ever want to go back up to the lake together? Maybe help me fix that old dock. I could use the company." For a moment, I was taken aback. That dock had always been mine to repair my personal project, but the way he asked, tentative, respectful, made it different. "Sure," I said. "When you have a weekend off, let me know." He smiled a small, real smile. "Thanks, Clara." The next weekend, he showed up with a toolbox, 2 thermoses of coffee, and a cautious grin. We worked side by side under a clear sky, the boards creaking beneath our feet. He measured while I steadied the planks, the sound of hammering echoing over the water. It was quiet work, steady and slow. Every so often he'd tell a story about his new job or ask for advice, and I'd listen. No tension, no weight. Just siblings building something again, literally and otherwise. When we finished, we sat at the edge of the dock, feet dangling above the water. The reflection of the trees shimmered below us, soft and green. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I used to think you were just trying to control everything," he said. "But now I get it. You were the only one actually holding things together. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded." "I never thanked you," he continued. "Not for the money. For everything. You didn't have to be the one cleaning up after all of us, but you were, and I was too selfish to see it." The breeze moved gently across the lake, carrying the sound of his words away like ripples. "You're seeing it now," I said. "Yeah," he said, smiling faintly. "Better late than never." When he left that evening, I watched his truck disappear down the road, gravel kicking up behind him. I stood there for a long time, the scent of pine in the air, thinking about how strange it was, the way healing sneaks in quietly without ceremony. Over the next few weeks, our family began to find its new rhythm. Sunday dinners became regular again, only this time they felt balanced. There were no whispered comparisons, no unspoken expectations. My parents were softer now, slower to defend, quicker to listen. Sometimes Mom would call just to ask about my day, no hidden favor behind the conversation. It was new, but it was good. One evening in late June, I invited them all back to the lake house. It was warm, the kind of evening that hums with crickets and smells like rain before it falls. I made a simple meal, opened the windows wide, and let the breeze move through the house. When they arrived, I caught my mother pausing by the door, her eyes sweeping the room. "It feels so peaceful here," she said. "It is," I told her, finally. As the night went on, we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees. The lake turned gold, then blue, then black as the stars began to show. Evan leaned back in his chair, looking out over the water. "I forgot how beautiful it is out here," he said. Dad nodded. "It always was. We just couldn't see it through the noise." Mom reached for my hand. "Thank you for letting us come back, Clara." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You never really left," I said. When they drove home that night, the taillights disappeared down the same road where I'd once driven away in tears. Only now it wasn't escape, it was return. The house was quiet again, but not lonely. I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window, the reflection of the water shimmering in the dark. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized that peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives soft and certain after you've cleared enough space for it to stay. I didn't know what the next season would bring, but I knew one thing for sure: I'd earned this quiet, and this time I wasn't giving it away. By the time summer settled in, everything felt different. The air carried warmth instead of tension, and the days stretched longer, quieter. Evan had moved into his new apartment, and my parents had stopped trying to fix the past with words. Instead, they showed it through small things, calls just to check in, invitations without expectations, a kind of care that came without strings attached. Work stayed steady, but I no longer let it consume me. I'd come home from the office, kick off my shoes, and sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light fade behind the buildings. It was an ordinary kind of peace, but I'd learned that ordinary could be its own form of happiness. One Sunday evening, my mom called to say she was making dinner for all of us again. When I walked into their kitchen, the smell of baked chicken and rosemary filled the air. Dad was setting the table, humming softly. Evan was already there, flipping through photos on his phone. He looked relaxed, in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Got a new project at work," he said, as I took my seat. "It's the first time they've trusted me with something big." "That's great," I said. "You've earned it." He smiled almost shyly. "Feels good to finally stand on my own 2 feet." Dinner flowed easily. There were no raised voices, no awkward silences, just laughter in the right places and stories that didn't circle back to guilt or blame. When it ended, Mom hugged me at the door, lingering for a moment. "It feels nice, doesn't it?" she said quietly. "It does," I said. In the weeks that followed, I kept finding small reminders of how much had changed. A text from Evan asking for advice, not money. A call from Dad just to ask about my garden. My mother dropping off cookies at my office like she used to when I was in college. Each gesture seemed to patch a small hole that had once felt impossible to mend. One evening after a long day of work, I decided to drive up to the lake house. The road was empty, washed in the golden light of early evening. When I reached Evergreen, the lake was calm, its surface smooth like glass. I parked, grabbed a blanket, and walked down to the dock. The boards creaked softly under my steps, but the sound was comforting now. Sitting there, I let the quiet wrap around me. The air smelled of pine and warm earth, and somewhere across the lake, a single bird called out. It struck me how different this silence was from the one that used to haunt me. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or dismissed, it was the kind that held peace. After a while, my phone buzzed. It was Evan. "Hey," he said. "You up at the lake?" "I am," I replied. "Just watching the water." "I was thinking about that day," he said, his voice slower now. "When everything blew up. I've played it back 100 times, wondering why I didn't say something. Why I just stood there." "You were scared," I said simply. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I was. But that's not an excuse. You didn't deserve that. Any of it." The honesty in his voice settled between us like the calm of the lake itself. "It's over now," I said. Still, he added, "I wanted to tell you again that I'm sorry." "Apology accepted," I said. He laughed softly. "You make it sound easy." "It wasn't," I admitted. "But it's done." We stayed on the phone for a while talking about small things, the repair work he was doing around his place, the new bakery that had opened in his neighborhood, how Mom had finally convinced Dad to start walking in the mornings again. It felt natural, easy, like siblings who'd finally found their way back to each other. When the call ended, I stayed on the dock watching the water darken under the rising moon. The reflection of the house shimmered softly, lights glowing through the windows. That same house had once felt like a wound. Now it looked like closure. Over the next month, life slipped into a steady rhythm. I stopped expecting old habits to return, stopped bracing for new disappointments. Each time the phone rang, I didn't wonder if someone needed something I just answered. That shift, small as it was, meant everything. Then one Sunday afternoon, I invited my family back to the lake house. It had been nearly a year since that night, since everything had changed. The drive up felt lighter this time. When they arrived, the air was warm, the smell of grilled food drifting through the yard. We ate outside under the trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves. At one point, Mom leaned back in her chair, looking at the water. "I don't know if I ever thanked you," she said, her voice quiet. "Not for the money, not for the help, but for being patient with us, for waiting until we figured it out. I looked across the table at Evan, who smiled and nodded. "You didn't have to wait for me," he said, "but you did." "I guess I was waiting for all of us," I said. When they left that evening, I stood on the porch watching the taillights disappear down the winding road. The house behind me was still glowing, but now it was filled with laughter instead of echoes. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of gold that slowly faded into gray. I walked back inside, closing the door behind me, and stood there for a moment listening to the quiet. That night, as I sat by the fire, I realized something I hadn't before. Justice hadn't come in the form of revenge or vindication. It had come in stillness, in finally learning to stand firm to protect what was mine and to let time do the rest. And somewhere deep down, I knew that everything I'd lost had made room for something better, something steadier. When I blew out the last candle, the darkness didn't feel empty anymore, it just felt complete. The weeks after that final family dinner passed in a kind of quiet that felt new, earned almost. The air around me seemed lighter, like something invisible had finally lifted. I woke up each morning without that familiar weight on my chest, no longer waiting for the next crisis to arrive. The calls from my parents became simple, warm, and ordinary. Sometimes Mom would just ask about my day or tell me about a new recipe she was trying. Dad started sending photos of the small garden he'd planted behind their house. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, and it was growing. Evan called often, too, not out of panic or need, but just to talk. One afternoon, he stopped by my office with a small paper bag. "Figured you could use a treat," he said, setting it on my desk. Inside were pastries from a local bakery, the same kind I used to bring him when he was between jobs. For a second, the gesture caught me off guard, but then I smiled. We'd finally learned how to show up for each other, without expectation. When summer stretched into its last few weeks, I drove up to the lake house again. The road shimmered in the heat, and the air smelled of pine and dust. I rolled the windows down and let the warm wind move through the car. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, painting the water in soft shades of gold and pink. Inside the house was exactly as I'd left it, clean, calm, and quiet. I set my bag by the door, poured a glass of water, and walked out onto the porch. The lake was still the trees mirrored perfectly on its surface. A few dragonflies drifted over the water, catching bits of fading light. For years, this view had been the backdrop of so much sorrow, confusion, anger, but now it just felt peaceful. As the sun sank below the horizon, I thought about how far we'd come, all of us. My parents had finally stopped trying to hold everyone together through denial. Evan had found his footing and his pride, and I had learned that strength didn't always look like giving. Sometimes it meant stepping back, standing firm, and letting people face their own consequences. I walked down to the dock and sat at the edge, the wood warm under my hands. The water lapped softly against the posts, steady and rhythmic. Somewhere in that sound I could hear the echoes of everything that had brought me here, the laughter from that awful night, the hurt that followed the silence that became healing. None of it defined me anymore. It had shaped me, sure, but it no longer held power over me. The stars began to appear one by one, faint at first, and then brighter. I thought of the people who had once filled my life with noise and need, the ones who'd mistaken my kindness for weakness. I realized I didn't carry anger toward them anymore. I didn't need to. Peace had taken its place. Later, I lit a single candle inside and left the windows open. The cool air drifted through the room, carrying the scent of the lake. I sat by the window with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the flame flicker. It was small, steady, and alive, just enough to light the room without taking up too much space. That night before bed, I wrote a short note in my journal, something I hadn't done in years. Sometimes the best justice doesn't come from revenge or apology. It comes from peace, from knowing you survived and you finally chose yourself. I closed the book, set it on the table, and let the quiet settle around me. When morning came, the water outside was glass, again smooth and endless. The light touched everything, the trees, the windows, the dock, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. I felt home. I packed slowly, took one last walk by the lake, and locked the door behind me. The new key fit perfectly in the lock, turning clean and sure. I slipped it into my pocket and smiled. Some endings don't need words. They just need closure. As I drove back toward the city, the road curved through tall trees, sunlight flickering through the branches. I thought about everything that had fallen apart and everything that had quietly rebuilt itself in its place. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And maybe that was enough. Life has a way of balancing itself out even when it takes time. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up teaching you the value of peace. Sometimes walking away is what finally brings you back to yourself. If you've ever had to let go of someone to find your peace again, I hope you know that doesn't make you cold, it makes you free. And if this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that peace isn't given, it's claimed, sometimes quietly and entirely on your own terms.